Hello everyone and welcome back. I am as always Inquisitor Aura and this is How to Roleplay in World of Warcraft, and this is the very first episode of the new series, Advanced Role-Playing Techniques. Now the point of this series is to start introducing newer or even veteran roleplayers to some of the tougher character archetypes and races to pull off in a role-playing environment. These subjects are occasionally considered taboo, but that doesn't mean they shouldn't be explored. Please note, this is where role-playing gets lore-bendy, but not lore-breaky. Please note that these are just generally accepted guidelines to socially acceptable and lore-friendly roleplay in World of Warcraft. There is a niche for every type and style of roleplay out there. What I am telling you here are the generally accepted guidelines that will not get you ridiculed. Our first subject for advanced role-playing techniques will be the Quel'dorei, or Quel'dorei, however you choose to pronounce it. The Quel'dorei, not their sibling race, the Sin'dorei, the Blood Elves, are the descendants of the exiled Highborn, who have not adopted their green-eyed brethren's habit of siphoning off magic to feed their addiction. As such, they were exiled from Quel'Thalas by the Blood Elves' current leader, Lor'themar Theron, who could not lead a divided people after the destruction of the Sunwell and their subsequent violent withdrawal symptoms. Those elves reclaimed the name Quel'dorei, having been renamed Sin'dorei by Kael'thas Sunstrider to honor those elves slain during the attack on Silvermoon and the destruction of the Sunwell, and left Quel'Thalas, seeking asylum in the arms of an alliance who betrayed them. There are a lot of similarities between both the High Elves and the Blood Elves, and there are some very important things in recent history that you need to know as both a High Elf or as a Blood Elf. The first is the destruction of the Sunwell. This is still very fresh in your minds. 90% of the population of Silvermoon was destroyed by Arthas's Scourge army. Of that remaining 10%, 90% of those began siphoning magic. That leaves a walloping 1% of all Quel'dorei left who thought that siphoning magic was both a travesty and just something that should not be done. It is this 1% that were exiled and became the Quel'dorei. Keeping all of that in mind, you need to remember that as both a High Elf and as the Blood Elves, because as a High Elf, you technically were both. Everybody lost loved ones during the assault on Silvermoon. And I mean everybody. No one who lived in Quel'Thalas for any extended period of time can claim that they lost no one. Remember, your kind were nearly annihilated. Many of you were lucky to have survived at all. And all the High Elves have the scars to prove it, whether those scars be physical or psychological. However, that being said, the major difference between the Blood Elves and the High Elves is that, generally speaking, the High Elves are allied with the Alliance, though many, such as the Silver Covenant, have chosen to ally with Dalaran, which is faction neutral, though even there they still choose to associate more with the Alliance than they do with the Horde. This is very important to understand because while the Alliance has accepted you, you have faced no small amount of persecution at their hands. During the Second War, the human kingdoms began to distance themselves from Quel'Thalas, and Anastarian Sunstrider, father of Kael'thas and then king of Silvermoon, officially broke ties in response, having declared that the High Elf debt to Thoradin, the first king of Erethdor and his descendants, was paid when they assisted Anduin Lothar, the last of Thoradin's line, in his battle against the Orcs. It was shortly after this that Quel'Thalas was destroyed, and Prince Kael'thas was left to pick up the pieces. In the wake of the fall of Silvermoon, the Quel'dorei, now called the Sin'dorei, attempted to reaffirm their bonds with human nations. Their closest neighbor, Lordaeron, however, had been broken. Othmar Garithos, the de facto leader of Lordaeron after Terenas' murder and Arthas' rampage, was their only recourse. During the Second War, however, Garithos' family was killed on their homestead near a lake, near the border with Quel'dorei. A small band of orcs had broken off, and while Garithos was off defending Quel'dorei, they killed his entire family. Subsequently, Garithos blamed the Elves for his family's demise. However, when Quel'dorei led some of what remained of the High Elven army to Garithos' aid after the fall, Garithos accepted. He sent the Elves and their young new king on suicide missions. Garithos' hatred and falsely laid blame colored his judgment, and the Elves were forced to endure extreme prejudice. Left with next to nothing and no support, Quel'dorei began accepting aid from the Naga, who granted him troops and help. For this, Kael and the High Elves were imprisoned in Dalaran, and they escaped only with the assistance of Lady Vaj. All of this eventually led many of the High Elves, including Quel'dorei, to Outland and to Illidan's Stormrage, who taught the young Sunstrider how to siphon magic and help his people overcome their arcane addiction. The rest, as they say, is history. Many of the Quel'dorei fled back into human-controlled territories. Some established outposts, such as the Keldanil Lodge in the Hinterlands and the Kelithian Lodge in the Eastern Plaguelands just outside of Quel'dorei. Many being mages fled to Dalaran only to find it in ruins, having also been sacked to summon Archimonde the Defiler. Now, it is important to note that there were High Elves outside of Quel'dorei when it was destroyed, but many of them were in Dalaran, though some inevitably ended up in other Alliance cities. Most of those did not return to Silvermoon with Quel'dorei, and you also have to remember that by this time, the Night Elves were starting to have a presence once again, and they don't trust you at all. They remember when your kind were called Highborn, and how the Highborn nearly destroyed the world. And they had zero problems telling their newfound allies exactly how they thought about you. So here you are. What is left of a dying race of people, a dying way of life? Now, for the most part, there are very few differences between the High Elves and the Blood Elves. You obviously have different colored eyes because you are not siphoning magic, but you are the same size, the same basic physiology. Most of your changes, most of your differences with your fell green-eyed cousins at this point are mostly philosophical. Regardless, you are still from Quel'dorei, and you are still dealing with a rather painful addiction. Unlike the Blood Elves, most of you have not found a way to sate it. The younger elves may have a much easier time with this, but any High Elf who is over the age of probably 50 is likely going to have a much harder time with it. Remember that most adult Quel'dorei were bathed in the light of the Sunwell from birth. You were infused with its power. This is not something you just forget about, and this is certainly not something your body just forgets about. Many of you need to find ways to cope with this anguish. How and if you choose to manage your addiction is entirely up to you. But there have been historic cases of Quel'dorei siphoning magic after the exile. And once they do that, they are no longer Quel'dorei, and they are welcome back in Silvermoon. And make no mistake, the High Elves are not welcome in Quel'dorei any longer. I do not believe that you will be killed on sight, but the Blood Elves have made it quite clear that those who do not follow their ways are no longer welcome, and you will be removed from Silvermoon and Eversong and escorted to the nearest border, where you will then be threatened with death upon returning. Remember, the High Elves and the Blood Elves, their philosophies on how to survive post-Sunwell, regardless of the Sunwell's reignition, is vastly different. Lor'themar could not and did not want to rule a divided people, given the atrocity that you had all faced. So he took the minority of you who thought that siphoning magic was wrong, and he exiled you. You and your brethren, you were never to return. All of this aside, there are very little personality differences between you and the Blood Elves. Centuries of insular behavior has made it difficult to integrate outside of Quel'dorei. And personality-wise, there's very little difference between you two. You have likely spent years living amongst your own kind. You know how they behave. They are long-lived. They think the long game. Since the exile, you have started growing accustomed to how other, shorter-lived races think and act. Let me put it to you this way. High Elves are not humans with pointy ears. You do not act like humans. You act like elves. And while there are individual cases of altruism in elvenkind, for the most part, there are very few differences between how the Quel'dorei act and how the Cinderei act. Now, since the Quel'dorei are technically a non-playable race, if you want to RP as one, you and the people that you're role-playing with need to be a little flexible in the imagination area, especially when it comes to your appearance. There are a number of ways that you can achieve the appearance of a high elf. The first way is simply to use your imagination and roll a either human model or a night elfin model. The human models likely look the more like the high elf, though you could go with a night elf as well because they are actually elves, and let's face it, once upon a time, that's probably what you looked like. High elves favor blue and silver for their armor, so that will go a long way to helping your case. And there are trinkets and disguise items that you can use to turn yourself into either a high elf or a blood elf for a short period of time. The first of these is the Orb of Deception. Now this drops off of any of the bosses in Magister's Terrace, but it has a very low drop rate. That being said, it will turn you into a blood elf for 5 minutes and has a 30-minute cooldown. You could also use the Orb of Deception, but this will only work if you are a Draenei. A Draenei using the Orb of Deception will turn into a blood elf. It lasts 5 minutes, has a 30-minute cooldown, and is a world drop, so chances are you can probably find it on the auction house for an exorbitant amount of money. You can use Ailee's Sky Mirror. Ailee's Sky Mirror is an object that will allow you to take the appearance of an NPC or PC and put it on yourself. This lasts for 10 minutes and it's slightly shimmery, but it has a 1-hour cooldown, and it can be found on Ailee's Sky Mirror in the Dread Wastes. She is a Pandaren monk and has about a 14% drop chance. And finally, there is the Reflecting Prism. This is crafted by jewel crafters. One reflecting prism has 50 charges and no cooldown. It allows you to swap appearances with somebody for 5 minutes. Now, I do not know if this works on NPC models, but there's nothing stopping you from going out into the world and just snagging a random Blood Elf's image, because why not, right? Like I said, this has no cooldown, but the item does have 50 charges, so once you've gotten through your 50, you're going to have to go and get a new one. Well, that is going to be it for me for this week. Thank you guys so much for watching. Remember, if you like what you see and you want to see more, don't forget to hit that like button. Don't forget to comment below. Don't forget to subscribe, and don't forget to tell your friends, because you can bring your friends here, and that means that's more subscriptions, and that means better content, because I'll have more. I'm planning. I'll put out a lot of videos anyways, and now that I have some more fuel for the fire, you'll be seeing these advanced roleplay technique videos interspersed between the Wraith class combo guides and any Transmog guides I decide to do in the future, on top of the class guides that I still need to finish up, which are a lot. Anyways, guys, thank you guys so much for watching. have a great week, have a great weekend, and we will see you again in Azeroth.